Hi everyone, I am Jayme Raynor. I'm the Development Director here at Good Samaritan Boys Ranch, and I am here today with Matt Moncado, our VP of Programs, to talk about National Foster Care Month this May. So, introduce yourself to the people.
Hello people.
So Matt, tell us a little bit about what is foster care? It's something that we hear about, we know it, but what really is it?
It's really a system for kids that have been abused and neglected. In the state of Missouri, it's run by the government to provide care for them.
So how many youth do we have in foster care in Missouri?
I think the last number I heard was over 13,000 kids.
Wow.
Somewhere between 12,500 and 13,000.
Wow, that is a lot of kids.
It is a lot of kids.
So tell us about, you said it's a system designed to care for kids when they've experienced abuse and neglect, right? So is it instantly that a youth would enter foster care, or what does that process normally look like?
Most often, it usually comes through some sort of contact with someone from the Children's Division, oftentimes a hotline. During the pandemic, they talked about how there was a radical reduction in hotline calls. Oftentimes, it's caretakers, it's teachers a lot of times. So if a report was made, the state of Missouri is required within a window of time to go make contact with that child, with that family, and just quickly assess, is everything okay or not okay? Oftentimes, I think they're not taking a child out of the home, but sometimes they are taking children out of the home. And most often that's because of abuse and neglect.
So what are maybe some misconceptions about foster care and the system of foster care that people have? One thing that I thought of was that a social worker would come to a home and remove the child, which we know is not how the process works. An officer has to be there, and there's several other factors that go into it. What are maybe some other misconceptions about foster care?
I think one of them is that everyone is removed from the home. I think a lot of times when someone knocks on your door from the Children's Division, that's a pretty scary moment. There's a lot of assessment components that they're working with families to identify the needs of a family. I'm hoping that the future is doing everything they can to not remove a child from the home. I mean, that's what they're talking about, is like put everything they possibly can in place where the last resort is to remove a child. But then the sad reality is sometimes you're going to have to.
How long do most youth normally stay in foster care?
It varies greatly on the situation. The sad part is that some kids come into foster care and they don't leave foster care till they age out at the age of 21. But some are able to return home. Ultimately, that should be the goal, is to get to a place where, if it's possible, to return children, to reunify them with their families.
In the situations where it's not possible to reunify them, what normally happens?
They go through a variety of cares depending on what they need. They might be in the foster care system. Eventually, they may be adopted out of the custody of the state of Missouri. Some end up in residential care, depending on the response to trauma and the impact that trauma has had on their life. One of the things that we have is a system that helps kids age out, so transitional living group homes, apartment programs. So ultimately the goal would be to get them to 21 in the best position they can be.
Yeah, so let's go back to that response to trauma. For a youth, like you said, to enter the foster care system, they've had to experience abuse and neglect. How does that impact the development of a child and into adulthood?
I just think, simply put, it's devastating. I mean, there is just no easy way to get around. So many kids that I've worked with as a counselor describe how, even though the situation that they're in a treatment center is better for them, they don't necessarily feel like it's the best situation because they're not with their family, they're not around their friends. Imagine being pulled out of your home, often unexpected, and to not be back in that home for a long period of time, even despite abuse and neglect. The long-term impacts of trauma are very difficult to fully understand. I think it takes a very long time for individuals to unpack that in their lives. And so that's why we need continued support for kids who basically they become adults.
For sure. So when we talk about aging out of foster care, you said that happens in Missouri at the age of 21. So that 18 to 21 time, most youth graduate high school around 18. What does that 18 to 21 timeframe look like for them usually?
Some kids just refuse to participate and they exit the system. and that can be very challenging. One of the good things that's happened in the last 4 or 5 years is they've allowed children to return. They may exit purposefully, and a judge may even release them, and then eventually they can come back and ask to be brought back into the system. There's benefits to being in the system. There's protections, there's healthcare, there's other things that's afforded to them. But a lot of times kids who've been in the system a while, they're ready to kind of break out on their own. Most kids return home in some form or fashion. They return back to the origins of where their childhood was. And that may have changed in a good way or it may not have changed. And so it's complicated for kids.
Yeah, for sure. How do you support a youth who's aging out of foster care? Obviously, we have programs here at Good Samaritan that do that, but what kind of supports do you feel like those youth usually need when they're preparing to age out?
It's just like any 21-year-old. I don't know what your life was like when you were 21. Crisis are one of the biggest things our kids struggle with, is that you might be doing okay, but then something happens, an automobile accident, some sort of physical injury, some sort of medical incident, something that's has nothing to do with their decision, or sometimes it's self-inflicted injuries. They made decisions that were poor, like 21-year-olds
Like most
do.
21-year-olds.
Exactly. And so then all of a sudden they don't know what to do, and they don't have the resources. They don't have family or friends or parents or someone who can say, you know what, I'm going to help get you out of this circumstance in this moment.
Or maybe even their own financial resources too.
Right.
Yeah.
One of the things I love about the ranch is we talk about the idea that once a kid, always our kid. And we may not be able to do everything for children, but when kids reach out to us, we really strive to kind of meet a need. And oftentimes we hear from them in really good moments, and we hear from them in times of crisis.
Yeah, for sure. So our transitional living programs here at Good Samaritan support youth who are 16 to 21, who are not going back to a biological family or going to be adopted, and they're really going to age out in the system. So how do our programs prepare them for adulthood, prepare them for what's next?
I think one thing we're real proud of is the graduation rate is much, much higher than other kids in foster care. So it's right around graduation time this week, and so many of our kids are getting to graduate, and then we encourage them to look at the next step. College is not for every child, but then maybe it's getting a job or going to some sort of training or trade school. They're able to get their own apartments once they're ready for that. Once they're in their own apartments, we're providing all of the things they need for that, furniture, and dishes and other things, and we're providing stability for that. The goal is by 21 that they have kind of a pattern in which they're used to living, and then we help them. I'm real proud of the fact that every rent dollar that they pay, we return back to them on their 21st birthday. And so encouraging them to pay rent allows them to build that fund up.
That's awesome.
It is awesome.
And I know that several of our youth have aged out with $18,000 more even dollars in their savings accounts.
Yeah, and they're in college. Some of them have had children at that point, but we're with them all along the way to help them.
That's really cool. What normally happens when youth age out of afterwards? So they turn 21, they're no longer in the custody of the state of Missouri. What happens after that?
Sadly, a lot of them really struggle. All of those issues that they've gone through throughout their life, they come back. And if they're not prepared, if they haven't gotten themselves in a good position, the data shows that about 45% of them either end up homeless or incarcerated.
Wow, that's a pretty staggering number of kids.
That's a sad number when you think about it. I mean, you have a kid in care for a long period of time, and you've invested a lot. It's not about the money even, it's about the person. And at that point, they stumble.
Yeah. Why do you think that outcome is the case?
It's hard to predict why someone would end up homeless or in jail. I think simple, what we talk about is a crisis. That they're not able to manage a crisis like the rest of us would.
Yeah.
And so suddenly, for whatever reason, that crisis overwhelms them. And they make bad choices sometimes. And so then how do you recover from a bad choice?
Yeah, and I think about, first entering adulthood, if you will, and if my dishwasher breaks or whatever happens, I know I have someone I can call and ask, or if I get a flat tire in my car, I know that I have someone who can come and pick me up and who's going to help me walk through that process. But for a lot of the youth and families that we serve, they may not have that person.
No, and one of the things we want to help them do is to identify outside resources, things in the community that they can connect to. But that's also a personal decision.
Yeah.
And you have to be willing to maintain those, and you also have to be in a position to ask if you're struggling.
Earlier you had talked about that your hope is to see less kids enter the system and more prevention and intervention early on before they even have to get to that point. So what are we kind of seeing, maybe some trends with that, or even action steps that we can take to get there?
I know the state of Missouri is really trying to focus on areas of prevention. And so they're trying to identify models of prevention and ways they can intervene in a different manner. Maybe it's earlier, maybe it's the way that they approach things from the very beginning. But ultimately, the goal would be to reduce the number of kids in care. That doesn't mean that we ignore abuse. You know, that's not something that they will tolerate. But I think ultimately, that's a fantastic way to approach prevention.
So what are things that Good Samaritan is doing to prevent abuse and neglect from continuing to happen?
Our residential treatment program, I always consider it to be kind of like the intensive care of treatment. For a child to be in residential, it should require a deeply concerning behavior. And so for a child in that position, the goal would be to radically address the treatment issues. And the goal for that not to be something that they're dealing with for the rest of their life. In like the transitional living program, or like in the apartment program, those are kids who've been identified as aging out of the foster care system. So our goal is to provide as much stability and training and opportunity as possible so that when they turn 21, they're in the best position possible for the next phase of life.
Absolutely. And what we know is a lot of abuse and neglect is actually rooted in poverty, and that's a big factor. And how, I can't remember the stat off the top of my head about how many calls are really more for neglect than abuse.
I think it's like 70% of the hotline calls are for neglect.
Wow.
Yeah.
And really what we know is neglect is a poverty issue.
It is.
So I think one of the things that I love about our transitional living programs is there is a big focus on that financial success of those youth. Not for our standards, but just to make sure that they know how to budget. They have a savings account, a checking account, and know how to manage their money. I know our apartment staff will help the youth go grocery shopping those first handful of times, you know, to really look at what do you need to spend, and this is a healthy purchase, you know, just because that's the cheapest option doesn't mean maybe it's the best for you, but when can you splurge on those things and have those conversations with them too? What other ways are we looking at in the future supporting youth who are aging out of foster care?
One idea that we have is we've talked about this concept of bridging, and the idea is to provide support for a child after their 21st birthday. Some sort of monetary monthly support that kind of lets them know, hey, listen, beyond your 21st birthday, we want to be here as a support for you.
Yeah, that's really cool. So what would that look like as far as keeping up with those youth? Because we know sometimes it's hard after they age out. Maybe they want to leave that part of their life behind them, or they're moving away, or just doing different things. So what would that look like as far as executing that program?
I mean, there'd have to be some minimal interaction with them. I mean, if we're going to be, supporting them financially especially, it's not about the rules of support. It's more about helping us figure out the best way we can support them. There'd have to be buy-in on their part. And our hope that would be, if a child hears about this when they're 16 and 18 and 20, that they know on their 21st birthday that we're going to continue to be around.
Yeah, and for those youth who have already gone through the program, and the transitional living program, they'll have that training under their belt and that knowledge and experience working with our staff. So they're going into it really several steps ahead to receive that support as they look at those next 2 years after they age out.
Yeah, what I like about the idea is just that sense of knowing. It's kind of like a safety net underneath you. I cannot imagine turning 21 and not having, all the support that you need. And so that idea that for some period of time that we would be there for them, for providing support, I think it's very encouraging. It's very interesting and exciting.
That's awesome. So what are maybe some other things that you would like people to know, having worked in this field for so long? What would you like people to know about foster care?
I think a lot of times for the foster child, they feel like everyone knows they were a foster child. And I think that's incredibly challenging for them to move past that kind of stigma that they feel. I've often told kids in foster care when we're at a public event, no one in this room knows that you're a foster kid. A friend of mine who grew up in the foster care system ran into another foster child one time, and he said he'd never met anyone who was successful. So kind of breaking that mentality that you cannot, that you can move forward in your life after you've been involved in the foster care system. I think oftentimes people just don't understand the impact of it, not necessarily the system, but the things that would lead you to be involved in the foster care system.
Yeah, and that doesn't have to determine what your future is. I think that's something we talk a lot about here is just because this was your past experience or even your present experience, that does not mean that that's what your future has to replicate.
Absolutely not. Yeah. So, and giving them the tools, and also just be honest about the struggle. This is not going to go perfectly. No one's life is going perfectly.
Yeah.
And so just prepare them for like, hey, there's going to be bumps in the road. And when I see kids that I've worked with, I always ask them, hey, how's life? It's not a judgment of like, hey, what did you do or not do? I just say, hey, how's life? It's so good to see you. Thanks for wanting to talk to me. It's always very encouraging.
Yeah.
And oftentimes they're like, hey, I'm doing this or I'm doing that. Some is good and some is bad. But I also tell kids, don't hesitate to call when you're struggling.
Yeah.
That's probably when you should probably call more. And we love to hear about the positives. We love it when someone calls or comes back and visits and tells us about their life.
So of the clients that we serve here at Good Samaritan, how many of those youth are in the foster care system?
On the residential side, a vast majority, like 99% of them, are coming from the foster care system. About a third, 25 to 35% of them, are also from what we call adoption subsidy. A lot of times people don't understand that if you adopt a child from the state of Missouri, from the foster care system, that you have a sort of contract with the state. If your child begins to struggle, that you can get help, that you can get treatment. And that's not the first response, but if it rises to a level of concern, that's something that's available. And so Good Samaritan has quite a few children and families in that situation.
Yeah, and what are some maybe protective factors, if you will, that can help adoptive families keep that adoption and preserve it and really move forward?
The idea of trauma-informed care is like this kind of buzzword that people throw around, but I think the idea of that is to really understand how trauma has affected your child. And I think a lot of times a very small child, people used to say that kids are resilient, the kids will bounce back. I don't think we have a full understanding of the impact of trauma in any child's life or any teenager's life until they're an adult. And I think telling adoptive parents, hey, just prepare. I always warn foster and adoptive parents about puberty. There's something about the surges that take place, the hormones, the changes that take place biologically, that it has an impact on kids. And I've just seen a lot of kids really struggle with that. And so things might be going really well, but then be prepared. But if you ask any parent that's had kids, there's just seasons of life that are more challenging than others. And so foster parents, adoptive parents are no different.
What are some things that someone watching this video could do to support the youth and families in our programs?
I think the easy answer is money. Every nonprofit could benefit from financial support. But there's other ways that you can help. There's tangible things that kids need. We have a great program, a back to school drive. A lot of churches and individuals will donate backpacks and folders and pencils. Anything a child would need to start their first day of school, our kids would benefit from. There's nothing like having brand new things. It really is a positive. But then I think Christmas is also a wonderful time of year at Good Samaritan. We are responsible for probably about 150 kids' Christmas presents. And we're not purchasing all those, but there's so many businesses, churches, individuals, long-term donors that have just repeatedly come out and donated Christmas presents, come out and help wrap Christmas presents. And so those are types of things that are very easy.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Matt, for sharing all of this with us and with the people watching this video. We really appreciate that and all the work that you do to support the youth and families that we serve.
You're welcome.